The snow had a way of swallowing sound on nights like this, turning every breath into a ghost drifting through the frozen air. The plain stretched empty and pale beneath a sky the color of bruised steel, and in the middle of that silent white world walked a young native woman, her steps uneven, her resolve fraying with each mile. She kept one hand pressed to her ribs, where old bruises pulsed like fading embers, and the other clutched a thin shawl that did little against the wind. She had left before dawn, slipping away from a place where her voice had been dismissed, where her existence had been tolerated rather than cherished. Now the land felt endless, merciless, as if testing how far a wounded spirit could go before it finally broke. Her breath grew thinner with each gust, dissolving into the air like smoke from a dying fire. Snow clung to her lashes, turning her blinking into a slow, shimmering struggle. Each step felt stolen from the edge of collapse, yet she moved as though the earth behind her burned, and stepping backward would mean surrendering everything she had ever tried to protect. Her dignity, her silence, her right to breathe freely. But the cold worked like invisible fingers, creeping under her clothes, dragging at her bones, threatening to fold her into the earth. Shadows rippled across her thoughts, memories of a man whose rage had shaped her life like a storm shapes a broken fence. She walked faster, though her legs trembled, afraid that at any moment she might hear his voice carried on the wind. A dim glow flickered in the distance, so faint she feared it was a trick of the storm. She blinked again, forcing her vision to focus until the shape sharpened, the warm amber gleam of lamplight behind a window. Relief and disbelief mingled in her chest. She stumbled toward it, her feet dragging through the thickening snow, her heartbeat scattering wildly. Just as her strength wavered enough to send her falling forward, a small figure stepped out onto the porch, wrapped in a coat several sizes too big, curls peeking out from beneath a woolen cap. The child stood perfectly still, as though listening to something the wind hadn't yet spoken aloud. When the girl's eyes widened, they glistened like two melted stars. She stepped closer, boots crunching softly in the snow. Her voice was a whisper, too gentle for such an unforgiving night. "You are freezing." The innocence in those words struck the young woman harder than any cold could. Her knees wobbled. She tried to speak, but the sound caught in her throat, choked by exhaustion and shock. The child moved even closer, lifting her tiny hands as though offering warmth from her very palms. She looked no older than 4, and yet something in her gaze felt ancient, a tenderness untouched by fear. The young woman tried to shake her head, to warn the child away from the danger she carried with her, but her body rebelled. She swayed, blinking against the dizzying blur of snowflakes. The girl leaned toward the cabin door, calling out for someone in a voice thin but urgent. "Pa, someone's here." The wooden door opened slowly, releasing a wash of gold light that cut through the snow-filled dusk like a promise. A broad shadow filled the frame, unmoving at first, then stepping into the half-light where features took shape. A cowboy, tall and weathered by decades of dust and distance, looked from the girl to the shivering stranger with a calmness carved from years spent reading storms. He didn't rush. He didn't question. He simply walked down the steps with slow, deliberate strides, each one steady as a heartbeat, as though he knew sudden movement would only deepen her fear. The lantern behind him cast long shadows that swayed across the snow, softening the edges of his silhouette. When he reached her, he didn't extend a hand or ask who she was. Instead, he lowered his coat, a thick, wool-lined garment smelling faintly of pine smoke, around her shoulders with the kind of care one uses when placing a blanket over a sleeping child. Warmth flooded her senses and stung her skin, forcing a gasp from her lips. "There's heat inside if you're willing," he murmured, though the words felt less like an invitation and more like a door left slightly open, waiting only for her to choose it. She hesitated, her fear rising like a tide that tugged at her ribs. She had known men whose kindness was nothing but bait. She had learned to flinch at gentleness because it often hit a blade. But before she could retreat, the little girl wrapped her small fingers around the woman's cold hand, guiding it with surprising certainty. The gesture broke something inside her, some wall she didn't realize she'd built. And so, leaning into the child's fragile warmth, she stepped toward the cabin. Inside, the air greeted her like a forgotten memory. Firelight danced across wooden beams, casting soft gold over a home that felt lived in rather than polished. Dried herbs hung near the windows, their scent mingling with simmering broth. A rocking chair creaked gently in the corner, and a small cradle rested beside it. Nothing here was extravagant. Everything was touched with care. The cowboy motioned for her to sit by the fire, and she obeyed, lowering herself onto a woven rug as the child nestled close enough for their shoulders to touch. Her trembling slowly eased, replaced by a cautious warmth seeping back into her limbs. The cowboy tended to the fire, adjusting logs with methodical movements, allowing the crackling glow to fill the room with steady light. He didn't press her to speak, but the silence felt safe enough to breathe into. She found herself offering fragments of her story, nothing complete, but pieces like torn pages from a diary she once treasured. She spoke of long winters in a house that never felt like home, of words used as weapons, of footsteps she learned to predict by the sound of anger in them. She kept her gaze lowered, expecting judgment or pity. Instead, she found only stillness from the cowboy and unwavering attention from the child. The girl, eyes wide and shimmering, shifted closer with a small blanket, draping it over the woman's lap, as if she had always belonged there. The gesture nearly unraveled her control. For years, she had survived by convincing herself she didn't need gentleness. Now a child was offering it freely, without expectation, without hesitation. It was enough to make her chest ache. The cowboy noticed the tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, but he said nothing, as though understanding that words would only crowd a moment meant to be quiet. Outside, the storm deepened. Wind hammered against the windows like a fist demanding entry. Every gust made her flinch, reminded her of a voice she once obeyed out of fear rather than respect. The memory clawed at her ribs, even here, even in this sanctuary. She pressed trembling fingers to her temples, trying to steady her breath. The cowboy paused his movements, studying her with careful eyes. "If someone's hunting you," he said softly, "you're safe in here. No one gets past my door without my say." Something in his tone, calm, steady, unforced, eased the tension in her shoulders. The girl leaned into her side, whispering that storms couldn't get in unless they were invited. The woman allowed herself to believe it, if only for the length of a single breath. But safety is fragile, especially for someone who has lived too long in fear. A sharp knock shattered the calm, rattling the wood from floor to rafters. The woman froze, every muscle going taut. The cowboy straightened, moving toward the door with measured steps. The girl clutched her arm, sensing the shift in the air. Outside, a voice roared through the storm, calling her name, a voice she had prayed never to hear again. Her heart dropped, heavy and cold. The world narrowed to the sound of that voice, dripping with possession and fury. The cowboy reached the door, planting himself like a wall between danger and the fragile sanctuary behind him. His silence spoke volumes. But the woman knew the storm outside would not pass easily. The man pounding at the door believed she belonged to him, believed her fear was his right, believed her choices ended where his shadow began. She swallowed hard, pressing a trembling hand to her chest as she braced for the reckoning she had fled. But when the cowboy turned slightly, meeting her gaze across the dim room, something shifted inside her. The firelight flickered over his face, revealing an unspoken promise, not to fight for her, but to stand with her while she found her own voice. The girl remained at her side, small but unflinching, as though she too sensed that this moment would shape all others that followed. The woman inhaled slowly, feeling strength return to places long starved of it. She rose, legs unsteady but spirit firm, and took a step toward the door. The storm raged outside, but for the first time in years, she felt something other than fear pressing against her ribs. It was resolve, quiet and fierce, gathering like fire beneath her skin. She stopped a few feet behind the cowboy, the warmth of the room at her back, the cold fury of her passed beyond the door. For a heartbeat, neither world claimed her. Her next breath felt like a turning point, the kind found in old stories whispered around dying embers. She exhaled, steadying herself. The pounding outside continued, but she didn't flinch this time. Something inside her had shifted, subtle yet undeniable. She wasn't the same woman who had stumbled through the snow. And as she opened her mouth to speak, the night seemed to pause, waiting for her next word, her next choice, her next step into a future she had only just begun to imagine.